am Christine Hayward, Executive Director at IIC Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. We are focusing on the topic of GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation Compliance. Leading the session from NotActivelyLooking will be Anthony Harling, Data Protection Officer. NotActivelyLooking is an online service that provides a way for senior executives to confidentially share their career information with select executive search firms. Anthony, we very much appreciate you spending time with us today. We are looking forward to understanding the impact the new legislation will have on the executive search industry and how we can ensure that we're in compliance with the laws. The format for today will be a presentation from NotActivelyLooking, and then we'll open up for question and answer time. You can submit your questions by typing into the chat box on your screen, or alternatively, you can email your questions through to Thaddeus, Andreas, or myself. So with that, Anthony, I will turn the session over to you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Hello, everybody. My name is Anthony Harling. I've been in the executive search business myself for nearly 30 years now. And I've been involved with NotActivelyLooking over the past 5 years. So I understand a little bit about what's involved from a database point of view, but I also understand a little bit about what's involved from an executive search point of view. And I'm the data protection officer for NotActivelyLooking. So it's my responsibility to ensure that our platform is fully compliant with GDPR and that we've taken all the steps necessary. So let me tell you a bit about the regulation. Some of you will know some of this, some of you won't know it, but let me just take you through it just at a very basic level. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's often thought that this means that it's all about data. Actually, it's not. GDPR is really about people, and it's about the rights that we have as individuals to protect our personal information and how that information is used. It's about the rights of the individual. The regulation itself was adopted 2 years ago by the EU. It actually comes into effect on the 25th of May of this year. So that's less than 100 working days. And it covers any organization holding personal information on EU citizens or any organization wishing to conduct their business in the EU, regardless of where you are based. So if, for example, you are a charity and you're based in Singapore, but you hold personal information on EU citizens, you are covered by the regulation. And there are some serious financial penalties, up to 20 million euros or 4% of your worldwide turnover. I think the more serious issue for us to think about as search firms is the reputational damage. There are clearly some search firms out there that are taking this very, very seriously and are doing everything to show that they are squeaky clean with regards to personal information. And we've already seen that in some countries, for example, in Denmark, there are clients who are now stipulating that they will only give searches to search firms who they believe are compliant with GDPR. So it's something that we need to be thinking about today. And there are a number of different aspects to GDPR. There are some technical measures that you need to undertake in order to ensure that you are handling personal information appropriately. You need to report any kind of data breach within 72 hours. You need to be very careful about how you store CVs, where you store CVs, how you lock your computers, what devices people use, things like that. And then there are a number of policies and procedures that you need to think about as well. So you need to think about what's our data retention policy, what's our privacy policy. There are a number of different policies areas, which I'm not going to go into today. But what you need to do at some level, and presumably this will be done at a global level, is IIC Partners, like every other search firm, needs to put in place these policies. They need to think about the ways of working, and then you need to make sure that everybody in your organization is trained appropriately. So I'm going to focus on some aspects that are specific to data and the way that we handle data in the database. But if you have any questions, please ask those, and I'll try and leave plenty of time at the end so that we can tackle your questions. So what about the rights of the individual? So under the GDPR, the individual does have certain rights. These rights aren't necessarily absolute, but key to this is the issue of transparency. every individual has a right to know who is holding their data, why they're holding it, and what they're doing with it. So that's the issue around transparency. And then there are some other rights which are associated with that. So for example, if you are holding my information, you have to notify me within 30 days that you have created a record and that you're holding personal information. Now, then I have a right to see what data is being held. I also have the right, if you're going to keep that information, I have the right to amend that data or ask for it to be amended. And I also have the right to object. So if you are processing my information, whether you be an executive search firm or a charity or a hospital or whatever, I have the right to ask that you cease processing and that you delete my information. And Article 5 of the GDPR makes it very clear that if you are holding records, you as the data controller, and the search firm will be the data controller, you have to ensure that that data is accurate and up to date. And if it's not accurate and up to date, it should be deleted immediately. So that's something which you need to think about in terms of your policies and procedures and how you start working with data. And of course, the real truth is that when you ask most search firms to do a bit of analysis and work out how many of your records really are up to date, the fact of the matter is that it's maybe only 10% or 15% of the records that are up to date. So that's potentially a very serious issue that you need to address. So what do we mean by transparency? You have to notify somebody within 30 days. That's just absolute. Now, if you start a search and you identify, let's say you identify 100 people on that search, and you're only actually going to speak to 50 of those people, then the other 50, I think you need to delete those records rather than keeping them. You can't just keep the record willy-nilly. Once you've contacted those people, then it becomes a different issue. You need to alert them. You need to send them a link so they can see your privacy policy on your website or whatever it may be. And if you decide to keep that record, then there are some other rights that kick in. But the fundamental point here is you cannot create a record on somebody and keep that for more than 30 days without letting that person know. That's fundamental. And what do we mean by accurate and up to date? Well, from an executive search point of view, if you are holding information on somebody, and let's say that information shows that Anthony Harling has worked for Unilever for the last 15 years and he's never worked for any other company, but your client requirement is that it's got to be somebody who has experience of working for a startup, then you're going to discount that candidate. However, in the UK, and this may be different in other countries because it's all a question of interpretation, but in the UK, the supervisory body, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, the Information Commissioner's Office has made it very clear that if you're using old and inaccurate information, that could constitute discrimination. And the fact of the matter is, as we all know, having inaccurate information is not a lot of use to you. You can't contact that person. You can't make a sensible decision about whether to include that person as a candidate. So the issue of the legacy database is pretty fundamental. You have to deal with that. You may decide that you're going to get rid of some records if you've got no way of contacting people, but you need to deal with that issue. Now, it's not realistic to hire somebody or hire a team of people to go through every single record on the database, because you're going to have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of records, and you can't possibly do all of that. So overall, what do we think this means for the executives? There's this point about the 30 days. If an individual asks to see his information, and by the way, this is really not very different today. If an individual asks to see what information you hold on them, it includes any handwritten notes that you have, it includes any typed reports or anything like that, you have to show them that information. The difference under GDPR is twofold. One is you cannot delay doing so. You have to show them that information within a certain period of time, and you cannot amend the information. And under UK proposals, if you start tweaking the information and deleting stuff after somebody has asked to see it, that could be a criminal offense, and you can't charge for it. So if somebody wants to see their information, you have to show it to them. So what we're suggesting is that actually, effectively, the individual is managing his or her own profile to a greater or lesser extent. It's going to be much, much easier for you if the executive takes full responsibility for managing his or her own profile. Because obviously the executive can insist that you remove it, they can object, and you're not allowed to keep old information. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the executive search world into the next generation, whereby everybody on your database, or pretty much everybody on your database, is managing their own information. Because once you get to that point, then you no longer need to ask permission, you don't need to obtain consent, and you can rely on the information being accurate and up to date, because at that point, then it's the individual themselves who's responsible for keeping the information up to date. So what are some of the other issues that you need to think about? Under the GDPR, you have to have a legal basis for processing. And there are actually 6 legal bases for processing. Some of these will apply to governments, some of them will apply to quasi-government organizations, and some of them will apply to commercial organizations like search firms. So you have to have a legal basis for processing, and one of those is legitimate interest. So you could, under the GDPR, you could say that, well, we're doing an assignment for this client over here, and therefore we have a legitimate interest in holding the record on Anthony Harling. And that's perfectly fine. You do have a legitimate interest in holding that record. Similarly, if you create information about your client, you need to do that in order to fulfill the assignment, so you can do that under legitimate interest. However, legitimate interest does not qualify you for keeping those records for years and years and years. You can certainly keep it for a year, and if your data retention policy says that you keep it for 1 year after the end of the assignment, that's okay. But you have to have a policy for that, and you can't say, well, we're keeping this information for 10 years or 20 years. That's not justifiable. That would not be covered by legitimate interest. GDPR, of course, also applies to your clients. So you need to think about what information you're sending your clients. So as soon as you send your client an email with a CV attached, then the client has to think about the GDPR implications. Because if the client has an email sitting on his or her server about a candidate, that is personal information. It's covered by the GDPR, and the client is responsible in exactly the same way that you are. You also have to think about data security. So are you storing information on laptops? What about handheld devices? What kind of password system do you have? All of these issues of data security are issues that you will need to address, and you'll need to have policies around this stuff, and you need to get it done by the 25th of May. One of the big debates in executive search is this whole issue around consent. So there are 2 bases for legitimate processing that we're going to talk about. One is consent, one is legitimate interest. So as I said, in total, there are 6 bases for legitimate processing. If you go down the consent route, you're asking somebody's permission, you're saying, can I please store your information? And that is a process which some search firms are going to do. And actually, as you may know, there are some search firms who are already doing this. So every time they receive a CV, they ask the candidate to sign a form or to electronically sign a form that says, we're allowed to hold your data. That's quite difficult to manage. And therefore, people are more likely to rely on legitimate interest. However, once you get to the end of the assignment, and let's say you have, I don't know, a 1-year guarantee period at the end of the assignment. So having had the assignment for, let's say, 3 months, and then you hold the information for a further 12 months, what are you going to do at the end of that period? If you're still in touch with the person on a regular basis, it becomes a non-issue. But for people that you're not in touch with on a regular basis, you've got to decide what you're going to do. Are you going to have some form of consent, or are you going to delete the record, or are you just going to cross your fingers and hope it doesn't matter? I would suggest that crossing your fingers and hoping it doesn't matter, is somewhat naive. Now, consent has to be specific. It has to be freely given. You can't assume consent. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create an environment whereby actually you don't need to go through a cumbersome process with consent, but you have the consent of the individual by the nature of them allowing you to see their record. So how can you obtain consent? If you invite the candidate to manage his or her own profile and they connect with IIC via NotActivelyLooking, then you don't need to send them a form. You don't need to get a consent form. You don't need to collect the signature. You don't need to store that form. All you need to do is to maintain the contact with that individual via NotActivelyLooking. What you can have is every time you receive a CV, you can send a standard email response saying, is it okay if we keep your information? You need to make sure that that response is consistent with the GDPR. So somebody in the organization will need to have a standard email response developed. And under our system, if you use NotActivelyLooking, what we do is we have a number of kind of automated triggers. So there'll be an automated trigger after 30 days saying, have you notified Sarah or Fred or Anthony or whoever it is that you're holding their information? Similarly, we've got an automated trigger that says, okay, the assignment is completed. What are you going to do with this information now? Because essentially what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, you've got your contacts on the assignment. So let's go back to those 100 or so individuals that you've identified during your assignment. If you're using the NotActivelyLooking system, what you're doing is you're creating a private profile. Whatever search software you're using today, you're basically creating private profiles. The difference on our system is that it's a really easy transition. You create a private profile. At some point during the search or at the end of the search or whenever it may be, you say to the individual, dear Sarah, dear Barbara, dear Fred, would you like to manage your own profile, thereby connecting with IIC, and you, the individual, become responsible for managing your own data. The other thing you can do is you can say, actually, we don't want to receive CVs anymore. So every search firm gets a number of CVs every day through the post or through the email. And they may come into your info at email address. You may have a London at IIC Partners or whatever, but there's a number of CVs that come in. And what we've done in creating the link on your website is to say, actually, we can direct those CVs to NotActivelyLooking. You do not have a GDPR liability. The candidate is responsible for managing his or her own information, and it's all kind of taken away from you. That hassle is taken away from you. So what are some things you need to do? You need to work out what you've got. So there is a kind of something called a data audit, and there are organizations out there that can help you do this, but you need to work out, where are we holding data? What sort of data are we holding? What kind of technology measures are in place? Is it just lying around the office? Is it lying on spreadsheets? Is it in a structured database? You need to work out what you've got. The next thing you need to do is you need to get these policy documents in place. There are a number of policy documents. You can find out what documents you need. So in the UK, for example, I mentioned the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. There is a supervisory body in every EU country, and there are a fairly standard set of documents that you need to produce. And there are some templates that you can find as well. So you need to, as an organization, as IIC Partners, think about those things and say, okay, what's our privacy policy going to be? Because we probably should have our privacy policy up on the website. What's our data retention policy going to be? What's our data security policy going to be, etc. You need to get those things worked out, but you have a bit of time to do that. You also need to think about some new ways of working, okay? A CV contains personal information. As far as that individual is concerned, that is important. That's really valuable information. You can't just leave it lying around. You have to develop some new ways of working. You have to think about, okay, this is absolutely vital information. It's critical information. It might include somebody's salary, for example. We need to respect that, and we need to put up some measures that are appropriate. We also need to make sure that the staff are properly trained. So you need to make sure that everybody understands this is the way we do things within IIC Partners under the GDPR regime. It's a new way of working. Search firms cannot go on operating as they were in the past. We need to change things, and everybody has to be trained. And my strong advice is you need to get started now thinking about your database. I assume that each organization in each country has their own database. That's normally how organizations like yours operate. That's absolutely fine. You need to decide what you're going to do. Have you got a lot of old information? What are you going to do about that old information? If, for example, if you invite those people to connect with you on NotActivelyLooking, if they're already on the platform, it's really, really simple. If they're not yet on the platform, you can send them a link and they can join, and it doesn't have to cost them anything, and then they can connect. So that's one way of dealing with your legacy database. So what are the concrete steps that you need to take? You need to work out what's going to be your platform. Is your platform going to be NotActivelyLooking? Are you going to use a different platform for managing your searches and managing your candidates? And you want a platform that's going to make this stuff really, really easy. You want the reminders to pop up. You want a way of transferring your, what we call the private profiles, into self-managed profiles. Because frankly, self-managed profiles is going to make your life a lot easier. And that's the way that the executive search industry is going. And you've got to have a way of working with your long-term records. So deal with the legacy database. If you've got old records where there's no contact information, you need to delete those records. Start that process today. You might need somebody to help you with some necessary documentation, and there are some companies out there that do that stuff. You probably need somebody internally, if you haven't already got somebody internally, to develop a plan that's going to allow you to be GDPR ready by the 25th of May, because the 25th of May is when it matters. So what are some of the things that happen today? Okay, it's very, very common. I think pretty much every executive search firm in the world is guilty of this. We create a record about somebody, we start storing some data, but we don't tell them. That is really serious. You can't do that in future. You have to tell that person within 30 days. One of the other things is we have CVs lying around. If they're lying around in your inbox, they're still lying around. If they're lying around on your desk, on the floor, on the printer, they're still lying around. You need to think about what you're doing with personal information. Again, under Article 5, it talks about accurate and up-to-date information. Most of search firm database records are out of date and inaccurate. Does that apply to you? I don't know, but you need to think about that stuff. The other is, what's going to happen if somebody asks to see their records? So under GDPR, it's called a subject access request. So a candidate, an individual, makes a subject access request. As soon as they log a subject access request, there is a clock ticking. So how are you going to send them that information? It's got to be sent in an easily readable format. You can't send them a PDF version. You've got to send them something that's easily readable, and they've got to be able to make comments on that. And you cannot delete stuff. So if you're going to deal with that information, you need to talk to us or somebody like us to help you dealing with those records now, so that we can apply some systems, and Andrew can talk about that later. We've got some technology which will allow you to go through your notes and work out what words are we using. Are we saying anything here that could potentially offend somebody? We need to think about that. The other problem that search firms generally have is you finish the assignment just gets, you just leave it on the system, nobody does anything. There isn't usually a lot of tidying up. Search firms are not very good at this stuff. So you need to think about what should we be doing about tidying up on the assignment. And if we're going to still have a legitimate interest in holding that person's data because we're in contact with them every month or so, that's fine. If it's not a long-term contact, you need to think about what does it actually mean? What are we going to do about it? So what are some of the other issues? Under GDPR, you need to think about transferring personal data. Do you have a system in place whereby you get the permission of the individual, the candidate, to transfer his data outside the EU. You need to think about that. If you're sending bulk messages out to candidates, you need to have some kind of permission to do that. You can't just assume that people have given you permission to do that. That assumed consent is not okay. People need to opt in for that kind of stuff. And again, we have that kind of facility on the NotActivelyLooking candidate database. What about your freelance researchers? Are you working with external researchers who are not employees? Because if so, you need to make sure that they have access to limited parts of the system. You know, this is something that we do on NotActivelyLooking. So we limit the freelance researchers to that particular assignment. You can control what they see and how long they have access for. But they need to be GDPR trained in terms of your policies, and they need to have limited access on the system. And what about the clients? How are you helping the clients? If you are sending your client via email a long detailed report, or you're giving them a paper printed copy of that report, you are creating a GDPR liability. Is there an easier way to do that? Should you be using something like the client portal? The client portal is a great tool. Basically, on the NotActivelyLooking system, you run your assignment, you open it up to a client, you decide how much the client can see or how much the client shouldn't see, and when the assignment is finished, you turn that off. You don't need to send your client reports either via email or paper reports. You don't need to send them anymore. You've got to think about, where's the executive search industry going? I think more and more we're going to see self-managed profiles. Executives do not want to be in touch with 40 or 50 executive search firms trying to check, well, I sent my CV to Korn Ferry 5 years ago, but I've changed jobs twice since then. Oh my God, I better contact Korn Ferry, blah, blah, blah. They don't want to do that 20 times or 40 times. They want to manage their own profile. This is where information is going. This is kind of the future executive search. You need to kind of get ahead of this stuff, because this is going to have huge implications for IIC and for everybody else. So that's my 30 minutes to give you a bit of an overview. I'm happy to take some questions. I'm happy to try and deal with any other issues, but Christine and Thaddeus, I'm sure you've picked up some questions, or you may have some questions of your own. So Andrew and Joseph, my colleagues, are on the line, and I'm happy to try and deal with those if we can.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anthony. That was a fantastic overview, and it's certainly given us all a lot to think about, I am sure. First of all, I'll just remind everyone that we are recording this session, and we will be making it available over IceNet afterwards. So if you do want to go back and look at the slides or review the information, that will be available to you. We have had one question that's come in. It's from Bepe, who's based in Hong Kong, and Bepe's question is asking about the enforceability. So his question is, what is the actual enforceability of penalties on search firms based outside the European Union?
Okay, it's a good question. The regulation applies if you're holding data on an EU citizen, or if you're seeking to extend your business in the EU. So let's say you are a search firm based in Hong Kong, and you have a client in France, or a client in Sweden, or a client in Germany. You suddenly they can enforce. They can enforce, because if they say, okay, there's an injunction against this company, they can prevent you doing work for that client. That's, I guess, what they can do. I think the bigger issue, frankly, Bepe, is think about the reputational damage. So if it's a global organization such as IIC Partners or whatever, and let's say, for example, it's Korn Ferry. Let's say Korn Ferry were found guilty in Hong Kong of flagrant abuse or some kind of GDPR breach. The reputational damage to Korn Ferry would be enormous. It would be enormous. It doesn't matter whether this part of Korn Ferry that was in breach of GDPR was based in Hong Kong or South Africa or wherever. It doesn't matter. The reputational damage would be huge. So I think it's really more a question of the reputational cost rather than the financial cost that you should worry about. I hope that answers the question, Christine.
It does. I think so. That was a great response, and I think the reputation is something for us definitely to keep in mind. One of the questions that one of the things that you covered was this aspect of people's resumes being sent into someone's inbox. So, on a very regular basis, we're all receiving people's resumes and CVs directly into our inboxes. What would you describe as being, best practices? They're not resumes we've asked for, they're resumes that people have actively sent to us. What do you think we should do when we receive those unsolicited resumes now? What would be your sort of best practices on how to deal with unsolicited resumes coming into the inbox?
I think there are 3 points to that, but I'll invite Joseph to comment as well. But the first thing I would say is you can just direct them to NotActivelyLooking. You say, look, please, we'd love to stay in touch with you. We don't have any assignments today, but why don't you connect with us on NotActivelyLooking? So if you've got something on your website today, as you do, then that covers that already. The second thing is you can say to somebody, okay, thanks for your resume. That's great. We store our information in NotActivelyLooking. Why don't you go there, manage your own profile, and then it's your issue. We don't need to see your CV because we can see it in the system already. And the third issue, let's say you're not going to have anything to do with NotActivelyLooking. Let's say you're just another search firm. You need to have a process in place. You need to have a policy in place. So you need to say, okay, we in IIC Partners, we're going to do this. So we have a data retention policy, which is this, this, and this. A data privacy policy, which is that, that, and that. And we have a data security policy, which is such and such. So then you would probably have those policies in place. You then have a standard email that goes out to everybody who sends a CV saying, here's a link to our data privacy policy. Here's a link to our data retention policy. As a firm, this is how we handle stuff. And then, so you have a template basically, and everybody uses the same template.
Can I add a comment there? Sorry, this is Andrew Quinn, the CTO. So there are practical ways. You have your policies and you can back them up with technology. Technology is there to solve issues. And a simple way of doing that is with the NotActivelyLooking platform, you have an Outlook add-in. So for instance, if you received an unsolicited email, there's a simple one-click of a button to create a private profile on our database and then automatically reply to that person. And we're also looking at a way of extending that so that you can then automatically delete any CV attachments. So the whole idea there was you receive the unsolicited email, you click a button which creates a private profile on the NAL platform, and then there'll be an option for doing two things. First option is to reply and let them know and say thank you and tell them to register or complete the registration and NotActivelyLooking. And the second option, which we're still about to implement, is the ability to automatically delete the CV that you imported. And that keeps you compliant in many ways. So the CV is not lying around, you're creating a private profile. But certainly the technology can back up the policies.
Yes, there's an automated feature that Andrew and his team have developed whereby effectively, I think it's one click, Andrew. You take a CV, you import it into NotActivelyLooking, and then there's a standard response that will go to the person who sent the CV.
Correct, yes.
Fantastic, thank you for that. We've had another question come in from Jacob Madsen, who was asking about the role of the data protection officer, and essentially, do you require one? And if so, can it be someone internally, or should it be an external consultant that you use to fulfill this role?
The answer is you don't need to have one. What we're doing is we're trying to make sure that we are on top of this stuff very thoroughly. I think what most search firms don't need a data protection officer. It could be somebody internally. There are certain responsibilities that go with being a DPO, and if somebody leaves, that may create another issue for you. It can't, I don't think it can be the chief technology officer, for example. There are certain restrictions as to who can and cannot have that role. And the data protection officer has to report at the very highest level of the company. So basically it has to report to the board. So it can be an external consultant, and I think there will be a lot of external consultants who will hold multiple roles as data protection officer for several organizations. So that's an option, but in short, I don't think you have to have one. I'm not a lawyer, So please, understand that. I'm not a lawyer, so but my understanding is that it's not something that's necessary for search firms.
Excellent, thank you. We've also had a question come in from Michael Eckhart, who has asked about, are there any standard policies that have been written up for, individual countries? So for Michael's based in Germany, so he's asking if there's any individual standard policies that have been written up that could be adapted for each search firm. Are you aware of anything like that that's been created, or do you in fact have anything that you could share with us?
So yes, I know about the UK. So there's an organization that I mentioned in one of my slides called Comply GDPR, and they have created a set of templates which they provide to their clients. So they charge money for the services, and they're helping search firms get ready for GDPR. So they only deal with recruitment companies. So they've created a set of templates. Now, GDPR is GDPR, so it actually applies equally regardless of what country you're in. However, there will be some local variances, and so you might need to have a slightly different document in Germany or in Denmark, for example. And I don't know that there are any standards in those countries. I only know that what Comply GDPR is doing is creating templates which cover the UK. However, I think you would be covered if you were, for example, the Danish office of IIC Partners, and IIC Partners had a set of organizational documents that you'd all signed up to. I think that would be fine.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We also have a question that's also been asked by Jacob Madsen, who's asking about transparency, and if you have a situation where a candidate or a person asks to see the internal notes that you've kept on them, do you have to show them those notes that you've kept, and how would that process work?
Well, if let's take the existing law. So the existing law in the UK is the Data Protection Act, the DPA. Under the DPA, you have to show them everything. So if you interviewed a candidate 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and during the interview, you wrote in the margin of your notes, this guy is really boring, or I hate this woman, or anything like that, unfortunately, you have to show it. You have to show it, even if it's a handwritten note in the margin of your interview notes. So that's the law as it stands today. What happens under GDPR is two things. One is you cannot charge anybody for making a subject access request. Secondly, the GDPR specifies that you have to show them that information within, Andrew, how many days is it? I can't remember how many days it is. I think it's 30 days.
Yeah, 20, I was going to say 20, 30 days, yes.
I think it's 30 days. So you have to show them within 30 days. And it's also very clear in the UK that if you start deleting stuff before you send them it, once they've made a subject access request, then you are liable to be committing a criminal offense. So it starts to get really, really serious.
I would say here that the notes are not something that one has to share to begin with. That is, it's only if there's a request.
Exactly. So under the NotActivelyLooking platform, the executive is managing his or her basic profile information. If you create an electronic note that's linked to that candidate, they don't see that on a day-to-day basis. They don't have visibility over that note. That's your private note. However, if they make a subject access request, you would have to show them that note.
I understand. I think that's clarified it for me. So we've got lots of questions coming in, which is wonderful. So I think it shows how important that this is as a topic for everyone as they think about what they should be doing with regards to their data. We have a question about what happens to long lists or tentative progress reports that might have been put together on LinkedIn using information that candidates volunteer to post on a public site. And are we allowed to keep such information in this form? And leading on from that, we also have a question where someone said, what happens if we contact someone via social media? such as LinkedIn, but I think that could also be applied to Twitter. So that question of, when you're contacting people or you're working within another medium such as LinkedIn, how does the GDPR work in that situation?
Okay, there are two questions, Christine, that you raise right here. One is how you handle long lists, and the other question is, what about the source of the information? Let me deal with the second one first. It doesn't matter where you get the information from. You may have picked it up on social media, but once you're storing CV information, you're storing personal information, and so therefore you are covered by the GDPR. And by the way, most of us in executive search who use LinkedIn, we're not using basic LinkedIn. Okay, we're using LinkedIn Premium, or we're using some kind of LinkedIn service that we pay for. There is an option, of course, that says actually what you should do is on the database, you just you use the LinkedIn link rather than copying and pasting the personal information. That's one issue. In terms of the long lists, again, you need to think very carefully about this stuff, because if you're creating information in a long list, it's still personal information, and therefore you have to have a policy around that. So that will come into your data retention policy. What is your data retention policy? And if you're going to keep that information, why are you keeping it? Because if you're going to keep that information, you just have to notify the individual within 30 days. It doesn't matter whether you're getting that from NotActivelyLooking or whether you read it in the newspaper or whatever. If you're storing personal information, you're storing personal information.
The storing a link to LinkedIn, so just keeping the URL to LinkedIn is still an issue, because any URL is considered personal if it then links off to information about that individual. And as Anthony mentioned, especially if you're using a premium type account where you may have access to further personal information such as contact details that they share on their profile with contacts and with premium people, then again that's an issue. So you can't get around GDPR by just storing the LinkedIn URL, because that in itself is considered a personal piece of information, identifiable information.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, I think the other thing to note, Christine, is that it's not good enough as an excuse to say, oh, well, I got all this information from LinkedIn. Don't worry. It's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the positive side, and this is, we're talking about all the threats and potential negatives and fines and the positive side is, and for those of you already using the system, you'd appreciate that the candidates who are actually managing their own profiles are delivering a much better resume or CV than those that even the best ones that a researcher could enter, because obviously the individual is spending a lot of time on making sure that every detail is correct and up to date, and they have tremendous amount of detail. On top of it, you could take your notes and your tags. So actually, the one part, it's not like holding information about people in a silo is excellent. And now the fact that they take control and are in charge of their own profile is some kind of degradation. It's quite the contrary. So I'm just trying to put a little bit of a positive angle on this. And actually, the firms that use us, and some of them including those on the call today, who see the profiles which are self-managed, it's still confidential. That is, the executive has to choose to share their profile with you, and it's just a much higher level. I mean, your researchers at best maybe put 5-10 minutes into keeping a profile up to date, when these people on a regular basis might spend half an hour, an hour. So there is some positive here.
Yeah, I think also the other aspect of this is that under NotActivelyLooking, because the candidate is allowing you to connect and see his or her information, you don't need to ask for consent. There is no requirement for consent, because the candidate is allowing you to see his or her information every day through their connection on NotActivelyLooking. So it just saves you all that hassle of going through the consent process.
And there's another aspect which is, I think, particularly relevant to IIC. I mean, each one of the people on the call is within an individual business. IIC is not a search firm, and each one of the local search firms is. Now, when a candidate shares their data on our system, and they share it, let's say, with Hochbergen in Germany, or they might share it with a firm in the US or whatever. One of the things that Hausmann, I'm sorry, in Germany, or with the a firm in the US, then one of the notifications that the candidate gets is, even though you signed up, let's say, to share the profile with Hohauser, it's being shared amongst all IIC partners on NotActivelyLooking, and before the candidate continues, they tick a box to say, I confirm that. So actually, it's creating, firstly, a database that can be shared amongst the firms. For clarification, you don't share your assignments, and you don't share your clients or anything like that amongst the different companies. But when a candidate signs up, they're sharing with all of IIC, and then if you exchange candidate details amongst you, let's say on a cross-border assignment, then you don't need to get the candidate's approval that you're sending the CV from the United States to Belgium, or from Belgium to France. It's all covered.
Fantastic. And I think just following on from that, you might have sort of covered this, but it's a question that has come in that I do want to address, and it's about, if I do direct a candidate to NotActivelyLooking, who has access to their CV after they join? So if you could just describe that process a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Joseph, you want to take that?
Yeah. Could you just repeat that to make sure I understood it?
Yep. So if does direct a candidate or a resume, someone who's unsolicited resume they've received, if you do direct that person to NotActivelyLooking, who has access to the CV after they join the service?
Okay, so if I'll give the full picture. If it's a private profile, so if it's a private profile, then only the firm that entered the private profile has access to it. The individual doesn't have access to it, him or herself. So private profiles are completely private to the firm that entered it. If, on the other hand, it's a profile that a certain firm brought the individual on and said, why don't you share with my firm via NotActivelyLooking, then by default, that candidate or that executive is sharing with everyone, with all the consultants on IIC that are using NotActivelyLooking. They're not sharing with anybody else. Once they are NotActivelyLooking, we never share their profile. We never share anyone's profile with any third party, ever. It's only the individual that can use our platform to then tick the box and say, okay, I came in through IIC, but I also want to share with firms 2, 3, and 4. But it's always the individual that has to make the choice which search firms they're sharing with. By default, they're connected to the firm that brought them in. In the case of IIC, they were brought in by one firm. That individual is sharing their profile now with all IIC firms on NotActivelyLooking. And again, I must stress, just because it's so important, that individual might be sharing their profile with 6 IIC firms, but the notes that each firm takes on that candidate are not shared. So one firm might say, oh, I see candidate X, wonderful candidate. The next firm might see candidate X and say, yeah, not very impressed. And that bit is not shared.
It's also, I think one of the things, Christine, that all search firms benefit from, particularly the smaller firms, is in reality what happens today is I, as a candidate, I get in touch with this firm, that firm, the other firm. There are more and more boutique firms than ever before, and there are more boutique firms today than there were yesterday. So in practice, what candidates do is they get in touch with maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 30 firms who might get them a job. That's what they do today. In future, what we're going to do is we're going to make that process easier for them because they can do it via NotActivelyLooking, but you don't own the candidate. The reality is the candidate gets in touch with loads of firms. We're just making it easier. So as an IIC member, if you're on the NotActivelyLooking platform, you can find anonymous candidates and you can reach out to those that match your search criteria and you can ask them to connect, but nobody is giving your IIC candidates to somebody else. That's not how it works.
Thank you for that. We've got a question that's come in about looking at who the GDPR applies to, and the question is about, is the GDPR concerned with European citizens wherever they're based, or is it any resident of the European Union, or is it non-European citizens? So I think we're talking about here, you know, does this law cover a European citizen who might be based in the United States, for example? How about someone that's a non-European citizen that's in Europe? How does it apply to the different, you know, candidates in terms of where they're based and what their nationality might be?
Yeah, so the law applies to any organization holding information on personal information on an EU citizen. So in other words, if there's a French citizen or a British citizen who is living in the US and you have that data in your US database, you are covered. So if I'm an EU citizen, I'm a French citizen or a Spanish citizen, a German citizen, whatever, my information is covered by the GDPR. So if you as an organization holding my details, it doesn't matter whether you're based in Singapore, the US, or China, you're holding my information. However, if I'm holding information today on, let's say, a US citizen or a South American citizen or a Russian, Chinese citizen, that information is not covered by GDPR. So there's a different threshold for EU citizens, and it's irrespective of where that citizen lives and irrespective of where your organization is based.
So one of the things that you'll find with technology platforms is they'll begin to ask people when they register, are you an EU citizen? And that's one of the specific questions they'll be asking. I mean, from a platform, you can often, you know, assume or work out where they may live, but you can't assume where their citizenship lies. The other thing to be aware of, you need a platform, and this is something that we do, that differentiates between the two. So you don't want a platform which will send notifications to everybody just to be compliant. Yeah. So you need something which selectively will send those notifications to EU citizens only. So you're not, you know, sending notifications that are unnecessary to non-EU citizens. So when you archive an assignment on our platform, it will ask you if you want to seek consent, and then it will only ask consent from EU citizens. The non-EU citizens on the long list, they won't be asked to provide consent because it's not necessary.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thaddeus, have you had any questions come in via email?
Yes, so we have a question from John Glennie in Dublin, and his question is, what are the costs of using NotActivelyLooking? Who pays for it? Is it the candidate? Is it the search firm? Who pays for the service?
Okay, that's a good question. Joseph, do you want to take that?
Yes, so the service currently is free for the search firms, and when I say currently, we're going to start charging search firms who sign up to use us as their primary platform in July 2018. However, those firms that sign up to use us as their primary platform before July 2018 are going to receive the service guaranteed to be free until the year 2024. That is, we're right now having a push introducing the service. It's something that one day we will charge for 6 months down the line, but if a company is the early adopter, then it's not only that you get the few months free until June, it's going to be free for essentially 6 years. So it's 6 years of absolute saving of what you'd otherwise be paying for CRM, ATS, or anything like that. Now, it's also free to 90% plus of the candidates. And will remain free for most of the candidates. It is a service for executives, when most executives throughout their career are not actively looking. And therefore, they'll be in touch with 1, 2, 5, whatever, 8 search firms. Those executives who want to use NotActivelyLooking and really kind of cover their sector and be connected with 20, 30 search firms, they pay a premium. So we have a premium membership for the executives. It's primarily based on the number of search firms to connect with. So again, 90% of the search of the candidates don't pay. under 10% do. Those are typically the ones that are actually actively looking. And it also means that the slice of our database is more or less reflective of the market, of having 90% plus not looking and maybe 5 to 10% yes looking. So that's the current revenue. In the future, the revenue will be derived both from that and from a search firm paying us a certain fee. But those adopting us now, are guaranteed, not to pay for 6 years. And moreover, leaving us at any point is no problem at all. So we're not looking for a firm to say, okay, I'm going to sign up before June and then I'm locked in for 6 years. At any point, you could leave. There are no charges around leaving. You could take the candidates with you when you leave, subject to you notifying them under GDPR. And that's it. I mean, it's a great added value, and right now, because we're introducing ourselves, that's why there is this long-term free period.
Excellent, thank you. Thaddeus, any other questions from your end?
One more question has just come in surrounding security. So Andrew, if you want to take this one, that would be great. The question is about, do we need to encrypt our servers? And what about if our cloud services and we keep our data in the cloud? So for example, from a security perspective, is it, a best practice to encrypt their own networks? And if they do store data in a cloud on a service such as NotActivelyLooking, how does that match up from a GDPR compliance perspective?
Well, I can't obviously answer what you do with your own data, but from our perspective, then yes, we are compliant. So what we do is what's required, which is all about ensuring that the passwords are salted and hashed and secure. Our networks are hacked by ethical hackers, so we pass those tests, as well as our data being stored and backed up securely as well. And again, in order to comply with GDPR, to take the extra step, we store that data within the EU, even though it's used worldwide. So the answer is yes. Well, you don't need to encrypt all your data. In fact, some things can't be encrypted. So, for instance, if you use your system, you have a primary access way of your email address of accessing the system, that's something you can't encrypt because there's no way of matching up to see if you can log in or so forth. So you don't have to encrypt, or you can't encrypt all your data. It's all about ensuring that you have the right, if you like, defenses in place to prevent access to a reasonable extent, and then also then reporting and managing any issues where there are breach. Because at the end of the day, no system is completely secure. As you can see in the news on a daily basis almost, then if somebody is determined to get in, then they can, as long as they have the backing to do so and the resources to do so. But for your typical level of security, which is expected of systems like this, then you are looking for something which has secure passwords, the firewalls and the services in place to protect the network, and obviously then the reporting and of breaches afterwards.
But Andrew, I want to add one point to what you said there, and that is about what every company does locally. Now, I think we cannot comment on what every company, as you rightly said, but I think that by using our system, the requirement for any local activity decreases tremendously, because communications both with your client and with the candidate can be done on the system, which means that theoretically and actually practically, not only theoretically, you can manage the entire search process without
platform, yes.
without the data ever leaving our secure platform.
That's right. So your client portal, the client doesn't need to download the system, the CVs or the documents, unless they wish to, but that's their choice. And again, using technology, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to cleanse your emails as they come in while you create secure private profiles, all those options and all these features will be added in, or are being added in as we speak, before the deadline. So the whole idea there, as you say, is we can't protect your networks, and we can't see what you do with your own data, but certainly from the point of access into our network, then we are secure and complying.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you for that. Well, we have come up to the hour, so I think that if there are any more final questions, please send them through. Otherwise, any final thoughts from the team at Not Actively Looking?
I would say that we're very accessible, and we're happy to answer anything else, both about GDPR or our system. And I think that it's a new kind of platform, but I think it deals with GDPR, and I think it's the fact that we deal with GDPR and that it's free are just two bonuses. The main benefit is in actually the power of the platform itself. Yes, and it's GDPR compliant and it's free, but for those of you who've seen it, it's quite powerful, and we're happy to demonstrate it to anybody else as well. And one other thing, and I'll just add one more word, that in joining us, there is no cliff edge decision. So it's not that someone has to decide, yes, we want to join you, and therefore we're dropping whatever we use today. Continue using what you use today, and then gradually try out the features of not actively looking in parallel.
I understand. I think that that's a great point. So I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our participants and the thoughtful questions that they sent through. And of course, a very big thank you to the team at Not Actively Looking. Anthony, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and Joseph and Andrew for your input. As I mentioned, we'll be making this presentation available over IceNet, so the recording will be available to everyone, and we will also distribute the contact details for Anthony and Joseph and Andrew in case you have any follow-up questions. So with that, thank you everyone for your participation, and have a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you are based. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.